Hi, this is Misha, and it's time to revisit the Walther P.38. We put out an earlier video on the PP, PPK, kind of revisiting those because I picked up a new PPK recently, and this is no different. I have a new P.38 that came in the store last week, and I should sell it, but I have this weird affinity for Walthers, and it really fits in kind of the evolution of my collection. So, you know, may keep it, may sell it, but either way, before I do, I thought it would be great to do another video. I hope you agree, because I think the P.38 is a very nice gun. I really think it's been underappreciated and overshadowed by the Luger, at least until recent years. So on the table, we have my Swiss Contract HP, which is a very early production in the series. To be fair, I pull this out any opportunity I get because it's a really neat gun. We also have a German military production, 1941, true P.38. So made pretty early in the war, certainly before the war turned. Then we have a 1943 Walther. This is the one that I just recently picked up. This one's interesting because it's a mid-war gun, and it really shows the transitions. You know, in 41, the Germans were still on the offensive. They were doing Operation Barbarossa, still pushing through Eastern Europe. By 43, though, things were stalling out. And so manufacturing had to produce more guns with less resources. And then finally we have a 1945. This is quite a late one. It's in the B block, so out of the 40,000 or so made that year, this one was made about 20 some odd thousand into it, so pretty late on. And it definitely shows late war economies and rushed manufacturing. And also on the table I brought out a couple of holsters because they were nearby. This is a earlier war so-called hard shell, and this is actually a post-war, but after the war they used the same. This is a so-called soft shell which came into use in 1943. Just had them nearby, thought I'd throw them out. So the P.38. As most of you know, I know, in World War I, the standard issue sidearm was the P.08 Luger, chambered for 9x18, excuse me, 9x19. That would be interesting, wouldn't it? Sorry, long day, guys. It actually served better in the trenches than many give it credit for. And of course, the handgun was always a secondary weapon and also kind of a badge of office. In addition to the Luger, though, the German military had many guns in 7.65 millimeter, 32 caliber, and some of the most numerous were the Model 4 produced by Walther. This is really when Walther became a contractor for the German government. The Luger was very ergonomic, especially for an early self-loading gun. It was actually quite reliable for an early self-loading gun, too. However, it was quite expensive and time-consuming to mass produce, had a lot of intricately fitted parts. It was only single action. And yes, it wasn't the most reliable, especially as time went on in Browning's designs, such as the 1903 and the 1911 came onto the scene and really showed people that simplicity is the best way to make a self-loading pistol working. But don't be too hard on Jorge Luger because, again, it was an early design, and for that it was very effective. The German military was very restricted in what it could purchase and work into in the 1920s because of the restrictions of the Versailles Treaty. And the Walther factory, in turn, who had success with the Model 4, worked on the gun that became the PP and the PPK, which we have videos on that. This is important because this was the first successful double single action system. Now these were simple blowback guns in .32 and later .380 9mm curves, but it proved the concept, and it showed the military, and many in the military, how a double action actually might be preferable. The main idea was you could carry the gun with one in the chamber, but have the hammer down behind it so it's safe, and you could either pull in double action or quickly go to single action. So in 1933, once everyone's favorite small mustache dictator came into power, I'm sorry guys, even if we all hate him, basically the History Channel is completely devoted to Hitler. So let's just admit it. He's the world's favorite dictator, if even to mock and ridicule. Anyway, when he came into power, the German government basically said, to hell with the Treaty of Versailles, we're going to rearm. To this end, mostly the army, but generally speaking, the entire military, put out requirements for a new standard service sidearm. It needed to be cheaper and faster to produce than the Luger. It would be good if it were double action, but this wasn't a necessary requirement early on. It still needed to be able to fire a 9x19 parabellum. It needed to have the ergonomics of the Luger. It needed to be accurate, basic things. Now, several companies heeded this call, and really at the head of the pack from the very beginning was Walther. They quickly started to work on scaling up the PPK system to fire 9mm. First, they tried doing simple blowback guns. Well, this didn't work. So they introduced an early pattern of the lock breech system, which actually had 2 locking breeches in 1935 with the military pistol, MP. This really led to further prototypes, such as the AP, the Army pistol. And where the MP really didn't have a lot in common with what would become the P.38 later on, again, a different system, it did borrow the PPK firing system, fire control group. It did have the exposed barrel, the open top slide, and the dual recoil springs. So those were taken from the early MPs. The AP, and the MP would have a concealed hammer, by the way. The AP would further this design, and it was with the AP we started to see the single locking block system later used in a modified form in the P.38. They would actually make a few APs experimental, and this would lead directly in 1938 to the MP-F, which was still a concealed hammer gun, but it was getting very close in a lot of the details to the later P.38. And then finally the MP-H, which was an exposed hammer gun virtually identical to the later, or the early, I should say, HPs and P.38s. Interesting that the German military actually type classified and nominally adopted essentially this MPH prototype in late 1938, when the very first prototypes were really available and evaluated. They weren't even close to having all the kinks worked out. But obviously they liked it early on. So they kind of adopted it before it was even in production. In 1939, Walther would officially introduce the HP, the Here's pistol, this gun here, taking everything they had learned throughout the various prototypes. As I said, it was based basically on an MPH that had been slightly updated, and it really met all the requirements of the German military. We're still firing 9mm parabellum. We have a double single action trigger system. We have a decocker safety, and this system is all taken from the PP. Also, we have a loaded chamber indicator taken from the PP. It is a locked breech. We have the general ergonomics of the Luger. It's not the same, but we still have quite an ergonomic grip. We have the exposed barrel. This was important because it gave us a 5-inch barrel, actually 4.9 to be exact, but it did not make it front heavy. We skeletonized the front. We also have this exposed open top slide, which dates back to the earliest MP test guns. again to save on weight. This also, with this large ejection port, gave great reliability. It's very hard to stovepipe one of these. The early prototypes had an internal extractor. They went to this external extractor before the HP was even in production. It proved to be much more reliable than in the internal system. This is still not a very large and heavy gun, all things considered. It's only about 8.5 inches long, which for a service gun is fine. We weigh in at about 28 ounces. Thanks to a lot of the skeletonizing steel frame. We still have the dual system. The locking system in this gun, which we'll look at later, a lot of you are familiar with even today because it's used in a lot of Beretta guns, including the M92 and the M9. Interestingly, we have these checkered synthetic grips. They have the wraparound back from the PPK, which means we don't have a metal backstrap. We have an exposed mainspring under these. We have a heel-mounted mag release, which I know a lot of Americans don't prefer, but for military use, and this one's actually quite large and easy to use. It's not bad. It also made it cheaper. It also makes fitting magazines a little more generous and forgiving, so I understand why they did it. These magazines held 8 rounds. That was the standard capacity. The early prototypes would have wood grips, but they wanted to go to more of a modern system, so they went to these synthetics. They're checkered. They are 2-piece, unlike the PPK. They gave them a little more better durability. To make this cheaper and easier to produce, we're using more coil springs instead of like on the Luger. We also have some stamped metal parts, such as this top section here, which actually, if you take this off, you can get into the internals of the frame. Excuse me, slide. There's some other stamped parts, and as the time would go on, there'd be more and more. And that was the early gun. Now, these were in production in 1939. They were sold both, the HPs were sold commercially. As I said, this is a Swedish contract, and we have a Swedish video that goes into more of this. They would pick up about 1,500 in Sweden, naming it as the M39. These would be sold commercially. And while these were cheaper to produce than the Luger, at the time they were the most expensive handgun on the market in 1939. But these were not on the commercial market very long because of the war. Throughout the 1939 to early 1940 time period, a series of test P.38s would be produced for the German military, known as the Zero series. They would actually make quite a large number of these, and as time would go on, they would test them, give feedback to Walther, and Walther would make small changes and send out more test guns. They would test them again, cycling. There were no huge major changes, but a lot of small incremental ones. We'll try to look at some of them. It's going to be hard to see on camera, I know, but we'll do our best. By April of 1940, though, the German military was satisfied and placed its first order for the new P.38. Walther receiving the factory code initially of 480, and going into production. Now, the serial formatting on these is interesting. They will do 10,000, or some say 9,999 guns, and then roll over with the suffix. So you would have the factory code, the year, and the serial with the suffix if it was over 10,000. The goal was to produce 10,000 pistols a month at Walther, rolling over hopefully a new suffix every month. Now, of course, initial production was much slower, but Walther would meet this goal by April of the following year, April of 1941. In this early time, once they had the mass production line up and running, these were proving cheaper than the Luger. They were about 3/4 the cost of the Luger, so that goal was met as well, to have a cheaper gun. They were proving to be more reliable and less susceptible to dirt and mud as well. So that's where things stood in 1941. We'll talk about a few differences here best I can. Pulling out my 41 pistol, the biggest difference you can see right away are the grips. We went from the checkered polymer grips, Bakelite if you like, to ribbed, horizontally ribbed. This was done a little easier to produce, mostly though for cleaning. They found the checkering retained grit more. That ridging was easier to clean out. Also a little stronger, just a better design. Early grips like these would either be black or dark brown, chocolate kind of colored. Another change, this has the typical lanyard staple you're used to, square cutout with a square ring. The early guns, like this, the 0 series and the early HPs, have a round hole with a round ring. Small difference, but the square is a little more durable and a lot easier to use. Some other differences, they would go from checkering on the takedown to ridging here. Again, a little easier to produce, a little easier to use. They would alter the sights a bit. They would also shorten the safety on the production P.38 versus the HP. It's a little larger. This actually shows an internal difference. The firing pins, the early ones, were a little different too. They're more squared off. So they improved the firing pin with the production guns. They also changed the extractor a little bit, improving it with the P.38. There's lots of little things like that, little parts. Most of the changes would even still keep the guns parts compatible, but you know, the military would test them out, give feedback, so on and so forth. And that's where the P.38 came into the service. So the standard production began in 1940 at Walther. The first, 7,300 or so guns would be produced under the 480 code, but then before the year was over, Germany would assign Walther a new factory code of AC. It wasn't just them, they were going from numerical to alphabetical codes for all the factories. So they would receive the AC code, thus making 480 coded guns quite rare today. And by the end of 40, you would have the AC. There are some that are actually transitional that have both codes as well. And again, like I said, by the next year they were at full production capacity. However, Germany was at war and it needed a lot of pistols, so Walther was definitely not capable of producing enough. Stop there. From the beginning, the Nazi Germans knew that Walther could not provide enough P.38s to meet their needs. So just a month after they put the first contract in for standard guns, in May of 1940, they ordered the Mauser factory to scale back and wind down P.08 Luger production and switch over to P.38. Now, as most probably know, there are no 1940 or 41 Mauser-made P.38s. This is because the folks at Mauser were very content to be making the Luger and really drug their feet for a long time in transitioning over. In fact, it wasn't until 42 that they had to be forcefully made to switch over, and thus ending Luger production and going into P.38. In the interim, in 1941, a new factory, Spreewerk, in occupied Czechoslovakia, was also ordered to tool up to make P.38 production. So it was the third factory, we'll call it contracted with, ordered really, to produce P.38s. However, it was actually the second one to go online. It would make its first test batch of pistols in June of 1942. These would be of inferior quality and rejected. Again, we're in an occupied nation and the workers are, not the happiest all the time. They would make a second test batch. which were submitted in August, and these were accepted. Now, a lot of these early Spree works were produced with some components from Walther, but they would quickly start making everything themselves. Mauser, meanwhile, would start the production line in September of 1942, finalizing the first batch of pistols in November and delivering the first ones to the military in December. These are very rare. While Spree work managed to get out around 7,000 guns in 1942, Mauser only got out 700. Walther, meanwhile, had produced about 100,000 guns in 1941 and another 100,000 in 1942. And they started to introduce some economies, some changes. The early guns, it's like this 41, still have a serialized mag and serialized grips, and most of the small parts have proof markings. It also has a high luster, almost commercial grade finish. Throughout mid to late 41 and getting into 42, running through those years, they would drop these features slowly. For example, the serialized grips would disappear, then they would stop serializing the magazines. Many of the other parts would stop receiving proof markings. They would also downgrade their bluing slowly over time to more of a military grade. And in the end, there would only be 4 serialized parts on a P.38. You have the frame, the slide, the barrel, and the locking block. So they were finding ways to make these faster and faster. By 1943, we have all 3 manufacturers up and running, Walther, Mauser, and Spree work. And of the 3, interestingly, when they did finally switch over, Mauser became the most efficient. They would produce about 144,000 in their first full year, whereas Walther would continue to make just over 100,000, and Spree work would make just under 110,000. The Mauser guns are often considered, especially as you get into the later war period, to have the better fit and finish. Now, these all have military finish, but the Mausers were kind of considered to be the best of a wartime situation. It was probably helped by the fact that Mauser had pioneered a lot of modern metal stamping techniques and other manufacturing techniques, so they were able to make the guns cheaper, but they still looked and felt quite nice. 43, we'll see some changes to the design. This is that gun new to my collection. Probably most obvious, we kind of go to grips that are not black or dark brown anymore. They either tend to be lighter brown to bright red and any shade in between, like on this. This is because of the mix, the Durafall, the synthetic. These are often called Bakelite grips, but actually they're a synthetic type that uses wood filler. And early on they would dye it to kind of mask the brown red from the wood. Later on they would add less dye. These are made by a subcontractor that both Mauser and Walther would use. In the early Spree works could have these, but very soon Spree work would go to a different contractor for their grips, so Spree work grips will look different. Speaking of looking different, by this point Walther has a military grade bluing, as on this gun. It's not bad, but yeah. We also have more exposed tool marks, as here on this barrel, and you can see some on the slide. Also, the frame is much rougher here, not as shiny. Got a little more, it's not ugly at all. In fact, I find it very interesting. Spree work would use a very dark bluing, almost black, kind of like a black oxide that Colt used at the end of World War I. So it's kind of a more of an industrial type finish. Mauser would go through several finishes in 43. They would do kind of a polished blue that they would do what people call the dusty blue, and then they would go at the end of the year to a military blue. A few updates and improvements were introduced as well in this year. They would add a small downward facing hump to the frame for the trigger pin to reinforce the frame in this area. All manufacturers would switch to this. They would also change the extractor cutout, removing the step. This was both easier to machine. It also made things a little stronger and more robust, so it was a win-win. They would update the magazines. You can tell an updated mag because it'll have P.38V instead of P.38 marked on the bottom. These magazines were dimensionally changed just a little bit for better feeding. Again, like I said at the beginning, because we have this heel mounted mag release, it gives us a little more flexibility, so they improve the mag for feeding. And that's pretty much where we stood. As far as markings, they were pretty well standardized at this point. Walthers would be AC 43 for 43 guns. The Waffen-Amt inspector mark would be 359. As with their other guns, Mauser used the BYF code, BEEF. Their inspector mark would be 135. And Spreewerk would use the CYQ code, and they would not actually they wouldn't year mark them, sorry. It was kind of interesting. Both Mauser and Walther would put the year, at least the last 2 digits, after their code. Spreewerk would not. And their Waffen-Amt was 88. Later on, WA88 would be added, as with WA359 and 135. Just again, changes in the markings a bit. Just Waffen-Amt. Germans, they like changing things. And that was the status of things in 43. We move into 44. All factories ramp up production. Mauser would lead the charge. They would produce 145,000 in 1944, making it their most numerous year. Walther would produce 130,000, give or take. And Spreewerk would produce 128,000, so just behind Walther. Quality would continue to go down, especially with fit and finish. And more economies would be introduced to the design. Mauser would lead the way with some of these. Now this is an AC-45, as I said, but it has some of the changes that Mauser would introduce. One is this stamped slide release before it be machined. Now we're at a stamped part. Also, this gun has some small parts that have phosphating. This was something else pioneered by Mauser and other German companies, but Mauser was there. In fact, some Mausers would be what we call today dual tones, where you'll have, for example, a blued barrel in a phosphated slide. Quite interesting. Walther never went quite that extreme, but they did use phosphated small parts. Another change was to the grips. Mauser would work with some grips that were of a true plastic material. The shiny black is on this pistol here. These are a little more durable than the Durafall, the Bakelite grips. Also probably a little cheaper and easier to produce. They're more flexible. They also scratch a little easier, but you'll see some of these late in the war. There's also some other crazy variations at Spreewerk. By this point, we definitely have military grade finish all around. Now, one change that Mauser did not do that mostly you'll find on Spreewerks, but it's on this Walther, is the so-called cog hammer. Instead of having several fine lines, we just have 3. This is made by a subcontractor. Again, another little bit of a simplification. And the magazines. This one, for example, you see, is not finished out. It's just mostly left in the white with the gold color coming from heat treating. They would delete on some late mags the P.38 marking and just replace it with a U, or sometimes you'll see them with P.38U. The U means it was a substitute late war where all the standards weren't met, all the tests and things. Some late mags were not even heat treated. Very late. But unlike, say, with the Japanese Nambu, that's about the extent of it. I mean, we have some more visible lathe rings on the barrel, some tool markings, but really they didn't go as low as some you'll find from the Japanese collecting circles. It's also worth pointing out that a few subcontractors made parts for the P.38. FNH out of Belgium, FN Hostal, would make slides, many used by Walther. They'll be marked with AC, but they'll have the Belgian Waffen-Amt of 140 on them. Some of these would also make their way to Spreewerk. Another company would be basically what we know today as CZ out of Brno in occupied Czechoslovakia. They would make locking blocks and barrels. A lot of these, of course, would appear on Spreewerk guns, and confusingly, their code that they used was FNH. But that doesn't mean FN Herstal, it's FNH for CZ, essentially. Kind of an interesting cross there, but just FYI. And of course, magazines were very frequently subcontracted out, and the grips almost always were. You'll find a few in-house made grips early on, but by the wartime, they were pretty much all sourced out, as far as I know. And that was pretty much where we ended with the P.38. They would keep producing these at Walther until the factory was captured. They would keep producing them at Mauser till the factory was also captured a very short time later, and also after the war, but we'll get to that in a different video. And Spreewerk would be the same. Of course, they would be captured by the Soviet forces, and they would make a few after the war also. We really don't know how many were made at this time because of just the chaotic system, record keeping, and of course guns assembled after the war versus before the end. We know Walther made at the very least 30,000, at the most 40,000. We also know that the rejection rate from the military was quite high because the quality was going down. Mauser made the same, or maybe a few more. Spreewerk made a few less, probably around 25 to 30,000, maybe 35. So you get the idea, you know, from January till April, and in some cases extremely early May at these factories. A lot of these guns would be brought home as trophies. Many more would be captured by the Russians and put into storage. And quite a few P.38s are to be recycled and used after the war by various nations, including West Germany, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, France, and some others. So that was the P.38. They produced quite a large number during World War II, about 1.2 million. The bulk were Walther, just because they had a much earlier start, but Mauser caught up. Walther would produce around 580,000, but Mauser would catch up quite quickly at around 350,000, and I'm just ballparking here, guys. And Spreewerk would be the lowest producer at under 300,000. But, you know, you get the idea. It was actually mass-produced. It was, in many ways, a much better gun than the Luger. Maybe it didn't have that old-world elegance, but it was much more practical. It was also safe to carry with one in the chamber, which is always a plus. It was more reliable. It was cheaper. As I said at the beginning, it was about 3/4 the cost of the Luger when it went into production. By the end of the war, this was definitely decreased to at least half the cost, probably even less, maybe even 1/3 of the cost of the Luger. Soldiers liked it, but unfortunately, it wasn't a prize trophy in America. Most people wanted a German Luger just because of the name. Now, I say in my Walther video, in Storytime episode 3, why I like Walthers, and part of it was like you could pick up a P.38 and bring home condition for so much